one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and Mammon. Pastor Craig will now bring us the morning message.
Don't worry about it, buddy. I wear glasses too. It's okay, Michelle. I got it already. I don't know if you know too much about a particular rich business tycoon. His name was John D. Rockefeller. And I know that whenever we've been talking in our Wednesday evening Bible study, we've been talking a little bit about this guy. His name's come up in passing. If you've ever watched the Today Show on NBC, the morning show, they always say it was filmed in Studio 1A in Rockefeller Plaza. Rockefeller was a pretty big, rich oil tycoon. And just to put things in perspective, if you were to take Rockefeller's wealth and account for inflation and account for everything else, and you were to put it into today's terms, Rockefeller made over $1 trillion. That's trillion with a T, all right? He was known as basically, and would have been known as the richest man who had ever lived. He owned Standard Oil, which that basically, if you ever heard of company Exxon, Chevron, and a couple other different oil, they actually broke up from Standard Oil. He owned that whole thing. So a man, imagine, with $1 trillion gets asked a simple question. They once asked him, Mr. Rockefeller, how much money is enough? And he said, a little bit more. Just a little bit more. This guy had more wealth than we would literally know what to do with, and he said, I just need a little bit more. Well, the good thing is it actually ended up a happy ending for Mr. Rockefeller, because towards the end of his life he started giving his money away, and he said that was the most fun he had with it. If you took a look at today's sermon message and the title, do you guys remember about 10 years ago, this is whenever a lot of the banks were starting to get in trouble, but they kept on trying to assure everybody it's okay, we're too big to fail. I know it's been like forever ago since that happened, but the reason why I entitled this message is because whenever you store your treasures in heaven, it really is too big and too great and too good to ever fail. So let's go ahead and dive right into this. We've been looking at our text on Sermon on the Mount from Matthew chapter 6, and before we took a look at how our lives played out in public. That's whenever we said about not proclaiming your good deeds with loud trumpets so as to get praise of men, but instead do your good deeds with rightful intentions and get your reward in heaven. Not because you've earned it, but because it's the formation of the heart. It's the formation of the heart why we do our good deeds in secret, because the greatest reward we can have is not money, it's not possessions, it's God. He's the greatest reward. And so we're now moving a little bit into the personal interior, the life of the everyday. This sermon is going to peer into our hearts a little bit. But to properly understand what Jesus is getting at, let me set the historical stage for you here. You see, I get it. Probably none of us like paying taxes. But at least in America, for the most part, you're supposed to have a system to be able to say, okay, this is how we spend your money. There's supposed to be an oversight. There's supposed to be some accountability. Back in Jesus' day, none of that was going on. None of it. Back in Jesus' day, you were ruled by another empire, the Empire of Rome. And honestly, if you're an empire that's got your boot on another country, are you going to really care about oversight? No. You're going to rob these people blind through all kinds of taxes. And so what would happen is you would oftentimes have these people that just said, you know what, we're mad as I'll get out and we're not going to take it anymore. And so you had little revolutionary movements that would pop up. And you'd have these bands of armed guerrillas that would be living at the same time of Jesus and said, we're not going to take this anymore. And so Jesus walks in, like usual, to a pretty pressure cooker situation. To a pretty tense situation. And he challenges us. And he challenges us with these words, because if we are going to pursue the perfection of God, if the last verse of Matthew 5, when it says, be perfect, therefore as your heavenly Father is perfect, if that's going to be the standard that we're going to pursue, then we can't let the everyday things deter us from that. I know all of us have to go to work. We have to feed our families. We have to take care of ourselves. But we can't let these things become so all-consuming that we forget the reason why we're really doing it. It's because God has redeemed us for this. And what Jesus is doing is he's setting really two different choices. One either serves material possessions or one serves God. Either material possessions or God. And he gives us a warning, but he does so in a way that teaches us, that instructs us, that says to us we can live with the kingdom of God as our number one priority, that we can seek his kingdom first, and then everything else will be provided for us. Everything else God will take care of. He knows that we need these things. He knows that we need the food. He knows that we need to be taken care of. He'll provide for this if we seek his kingdom first in our lives. And so, what he's doing here is he's telling us not to worry. But before I get into this a little bit, a couple little different caveats I have to throw out there. You see, some Christians think that if you spend too much time in the physical, you start to neglect the spiritual. And that's true to a certain point. But some Christians on the other side of that thought, okay, well, if I spend so much time in prayer, I don't have to worry about taking care of my family, and that doesn't work that way. All right? It doesn't work that way. This is not physical versus spiritual. This is us taking care to be growing spiritually and trusting God to provide for the physical. It's trusting God to provide, to take care of our needs. And if we seek his kingdom, he promises to do that. The other thing I have to challenge us here on is if you have money, people that have money, they're not necessarily good, they're not necessarily bad. People who are poor, not necessarily good, not necessarily bad. There are some people out there who are rich who really did earn it. They saved it, they did everything right. Maybe they had a good job, maybe they had a very smart intelligence. And maybe they're doing very well for themselves. There's also some rich people out there who stole it, who engaged in a lot of unethical behavior. There are some poor people out there who may have made some bad decisions in their life. But there's also some poor people out there who are poor through no fault of their own. And the temptation that we run into in our daily lives today is to think that if somebody has money, they're automatically blessed by God. Not true. Not true. That's what Jesus is teaching us here. That's what Jesus is challenging us here. And I'll tell you what, honestly, wealth carries two interesting dangers. Two interesting dangers. The first one is that we get a false sense of security. So in the physical sense, we can think, oh, I've stored up, I've done all of this, so now I no longer have to rely on God for anything. And the second danger is that if whenever you start getting all the money, there's a temptation to start believing your own press. The temptation to go, look how much I'm blessed, I must be doing something right. Maybe. Or maybe God's challenging each and every one of us to take a look inside of our own hearts and ask ourselves, for what reasons do we have the money, and what now can we do with it? And this is actually part one of a two-part sermon. We're going to get to this part next week. We're going to get to Jesus' teaching about not worrying. So, if you leave here today and you're thinking, I just want a little bit more, come back next week. But there's a pattern of two here. Jesus talks about treasures, he talks about eyes, and he talks about masters. There's two different treasures, treasure on earth, treasure in heaven, two different eyes, the good and the bad, and two different masters, God or wealth. And that's exactly what we're going to get into here. It's interesting because I took a look at the text here, and if you read this sermon back, or read this biblical text rather back in the original Greek, Jesus says, don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth. He's actually using a pun. The literal Greek for that is don't treasure up for yourselves treasure on earth. He's doubling down here. He's saying don't treasure up for yourselves treasure on earth. He's basically using a pun. And so really what this word of rust where moth and rust can destroy and where thieves break in and steal. That word back in the Greek actually has some pretty interesting meanings because back then they believed that your crops could rust. It's the same word. So instead of rot, they say your crops rusted. And there was actually used to describe you to take care of your teeth, they rusted. Seriously, that's the word they used for it. I hate to go to that dentist. And so what they would do back in Jesus' days, they used to come up with all kind of creative ways for being able to protect their wealth. Some people used to wear it in a bag around their neck. Some people used to dig holes in their backyard. And we've all heard those stories, those old-time houses during the Depression where they used to store cash in the walls. Some of us have heard stories like that. Oftentimes people during Jesus' day used to take it to the money changers in the temple. They said, hang on to this. Or they would put it in the temple treasury itself. It says, there, now my investment is secure. And just like today, people look for all kinds of ways to secure it. Trust fund, mutual fund, CD, savings account, burying it in the walls. But honestly, just like back then, and just like today, nothing's 100% secure. Nothing. We try to keep in our house, houses get broken into. I can't tell you how many times I've heard stories when people would say, I left this thing in a mutual fund, I left this thing in an escrow account, which you're not even supposed to be able to touch those at all, and yet whoever was running the fund stole it. Nothing's secure. Jesus is giving us a reality check here. And so moth and rust, destroying and thieves breaking in and stealing, that literally happened. But that also figuratively happened a whole lot. Nothing was secure in the ancient world. Nothing's secure in our world. And what he's saying here is that we should not value that enough that we stop seeking him. The possession and the desire for more and more stuff should not be the only thing that we're ever consumed with, because it never satisfies. And you want to know what ends up happening? If you're storing up for yourselves treasure on earth, the things you own end up owning you. The things you own end up owning you. The more you have, the more you have to be responsible for. That's what Jesus is getting at. He doesn't want us pulled down by all of this. And so he says, instead of storing up for yourselves treasure on earth, go rather instead and store yourself up treasure in heaven. And what that basically means is it's a breaking free from the worship of all earthly things. So you might be asking, how do we store up treasure in heaven? How does that work? Do I have to call a special heavenly investment broker? Do I have to know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody? Do I have to call a certain phone? How do I invest? How do I put treasure in the kingdom of heaven? Well, all you got to do is obey him. Every single thing that we do, if done with the proper intention to serve God, that is storing up for ourselves treasure in heaven. Every single thing that we do to serve God, that is storing up for ourselves treasure in heaven. Interestingly enough, the early church thought wealth was only to be used for three reasons: care for your family, help for those in need, and spreading the gospel. I know the pastor's talking about money here, but stay with me. What Jesus is illustrating between storing up for yourself treasure on earth versus treasure in heaven, and he talks about the heart, for where your treasure is, there your heart is also. He's setting up a contrast of values. He's setting up where your treasure is doesn't just simply mean where your emotions are at. For the heart just doesn't mean the emotions like we think. The heart, what Jesus is meaning here, is us. It's the whole person. What makes you you. So what Jesus is saying, where you spend and put your time, your priorities, your energy, that's going to reveal where your heart is. Because you can say you're a Christian all you want, but if all you're doing is investing treasures on earth, that's where your heart's at. You can say you believe, you can say you do all the right things, the Christian type things, but by your fruits you're going to be known. By my fruits I'm going to be known. We must continue to store up treasure in heaven. And so the values that are driven here by what is in your heart and mind and soul, that's a reflection of what you truly believe. Whatever you value is a reflection of what you believe, and that's going to work itself out in how you live. And really, there's two choices. There's the creation and the creator. Only two. There's God and there is what he made. There's really no third option here. And if your creation is exactly what you're focusing, where you're investing all of your time, your energy, where your treasure is going, then after a while it's going to rot. After a while it's going to burn. After a while it's not going to be there anymore. But if it's the creator, if you're attaching yourself to God, if that's where you're putting your treasures at, then all else pales in comparison. Now you might be asking yourself, why would I want to do this? Why would I want to do this? Brothers and sisters, if nothing else, listen to these words. Store for yourself treasure in heaven, because in God's eyes, you're his treasure. You're his treasure. He loves each and every one of us so much. He made us his treasure. He didn't have to. He chose to do this. We love because he first loved us. We are God's treasure. And whenever we make his son our treasure, we become his. We become his. We talked about the two treasures. Now we go to the two eyes. What are you looking for? Not just right now with these two eyeballs. What are you looking for? You see, eyes in this particular text, think of them like pipes. Pipes carry water, pipes carry gas, pipes carry solid, pipes carry all kinds of things. Look at your eyes like they're pipes. And ask yourself, what are you looking for? For the good eyes emit light, the bad eyes fail to do so. The bad eyes blocks light. Because if you're filling your eyes, if what you're looking for is all these different things that aren't satisfying, your heart's going to grow dark. Because you're going to keep chasing after things that will never satisfy. You're going to keep chasing after things that are going to leave you empty inside. And oftentimes what ends up happening is it starts off here, and then we let it sink into the mind, and then we let it sink into the heart, and suddenly that thing becomes the reason for living. And that's where the idol comes into play. We got to guard our eyes here. And if your eyes are being filled with everything else, all kinds of personal security and earthly treasure, evil's going to fill here. For you cannot see the truth, and you'll be left in darkness. But rather, we must look with the good eye. For when the eye focuses on something of value, it becomes the pipes that fill the heart with what it focuses on. And if your eyes are constantly looking after God's work, if your eyes are constantly searching after him, then your whole body is going to be filled with light. Because that light will travel through the pipes and go down here and it'll fill up everything. Whatever your desire, that's what Jesus is getting at. Whatever you desire, that's what you're going to fill your heart with. If your desire is for more stuff, that's where your heart's going to be attuned to. If your desire is for more money, that's what it's going to be attuned to. But if your desire is for more God, that's where the heart's going to get filled. And that is where the treasure is not going to rust. That's where the treasure is not going to get stolen and broken into. If we continually fill our eyes with that. So how do we do it? Well, Chris talked about glasses. And it's interesting. These things, well, I'm legally blind if I don't have them on. Alright? Honestly. Somebody back there could hold up a number, fingers, I can't see a thing. Alright? Right now, everybody here is blurry. So if you might be asking, what are good eyes? I would say this. If this represents how God sees the world, then I would encourage you, ask him to give you his eyes. Ask him to give you the ability to see people the way he does. To to look at the events around you and to give you wisdom and understanding, to be able to view the world the way he does. And then what he'll do is he'll give you his eyes, and suddenly everything clears a bell. That's what it means to have the good eyes of the kingdom of God. And so we went from 2 treasures, we got to 2 eyes, and now we're going to hit 2 masters. And interestingly enough, what Jesus does here is he says, you're going to be loyal to the one and not the other. You'll hate the one, you'll despise the other. He's using a term that might make us a little uncomfortable, because he says no servant can use 2 masters. But we think of servant today like a butler or a maid, somebody who comes in, cleans, gets paid, leaves. Jesus wasn't using that word. He was using a word that might make us bristle a little bit. Slave. You see, whenever you're a servant and you have multiple houses to clean or multiple families to wait on, you can get paid a couple of different times, and you don't have to get personal with your master. You just go, you do your job, you leave. It's easy to serve a bunch of masters whenever you're a servant, but whenever you're a slave, especially back in Jesus' day, you were tied to one master. And you couldn't be loyal to anybody else because it wouldn't work that way. There was a personal relationship, just like what we've looked at in previous sermons. There was a personal relationship between slave and master. They trusted each other. They were loyal to one another, especially the master to the slave. And so what Jesus is calling on here is he wants us to be slaves to him because he's warning us of something. All these other things, these other masters, they're eventually going to want full loyalty. At first it might not be looking like that. At first it might be just a little bit of dabbling. But eventually those other masters, those idols, are going to want you. Lock, stock, and barrel. They're going to want that full allegiance. And so what Jesus is calling on here is to be able to give him that full allegiance. To be able to be sold out and be a slave to him. To be a slave to him. Whatever you store up, you will spend most of your time thinking about. And it's interestingly also here, not just with slave. Whenever Jesus talks about loving one and despising the other, these aren't emotions. It's deeper than that. Loving means you're faithful to the relationship. Hatred means you just don't care about the other thing. So don't underestimate how radical this call is. Don't underestimate what Jesus is asking of us here. Because this is him asking us to draw a line in the sand and say, which master are we really serving? Which master are we really a slave to? Him or something else? Him or something that's ultimately going to lead to death? Because ultimately, friends, we might have all these other masters that have these different masks on, wealth and career and this and that. But really, the Bible lays out two. God or Satan. And I'm not getting fanatical here. What I'm saying is this. If God is the source of true life, then if you serve and are a slave to anything else, where does that automatically lead to? Death. Life or death, good or evil, there's no in between on this. You're either going to serve a God who is the God of life, or you're going to serve a false God that's eventually going to lead you to death. And so what he says is that you can't serve God and man in both. What he's basically doing is he's personifying money in this case as a rival God. Because Satan uses money to lead people into material idolatry, because we've forgotten the real reason why we have the money. And what happens is we end up making gods that aren't gods. And we hoard it and we collect it, only to die and never enjoy it. And if you go for those masters, they never give you satisfaction. We talked about this before. With an idol, it's damned if you do and damned if you don't. Because if you don't get the idol, it never forgives you, and if you do get it, it never satisfies you. And if you're thinking wealth's going to do it, look at Rockefeller. He was never satisfied. Just a little bit more, he says. $1 trillion, but I just need a little bit more. The wealth's never going to do it. The power's never going to do it. The prestige is never going to do it. There's only one master that's ever going to be able to redeem us. And you want to know what the great thing about this master being a slave to him? He doesn't treat you like a slave. Seriously, Jesus doesn't treat any of us like a slave. For if we're a slave to Christ, we have freedom. Freedom. Paul said that we're free in Christ, yet a slave to Christ. And you might be asking, what does that mean? How can we have freedom on the one hand and yet be a slave to him on the other? I'm going to get to that. Slavery to Christ makes us free because we have to remember what he did. We have to remember what he did. He became a slave so that we might have freedom. When the Son of God took on flesh and dwelt among us, he was humbling himself. When he stooped down and he washed the disciples' feet, he was acting like a slave to them. When he died on the cross, he became a slave to death. Whenever he takes our lives and redeems us, he's stooping down and serving us. That's what makes us free, because we're not treated like slaves anymore. And I'm going to challenge you guys on something. You name me one idol that ever loved you that deeply. Name me one idol that ever loved you, that ever served you, that never demanded anything from you in return. We can't. But Christ did love that deeply, served us by giving and rising and dying. Served us by giving his life, dying, and raising from the dead. That's what he did for us, so that we can have faith in him. And you know something? Jesus has every right to demand from us everything, but he never does. There's never a demand there. There's an invitation. There's a wooing. There's a come to me to find life. The idols demand, and yet the one God that has the right to demand everything doesn't. Instead beckons us, invites us, calls us to follow him and to find life. And if you store up treasure with him, if he becomes your master, you never fade. It can't be stolen or used or wiped out. That's what it means to have slavery in Jesus and yet be free. For we're free, and the fact that we're free from death and slavery and sin, and we're not given over to the temptations. And yet we're a slave to love and peace and truth and justice. So in actuality, we have freedom with a purpose. We're free to serve God unhindered. And Paul, interestingly enough, says the love of Christ constrains us. The love of Christ is both freeing and constraining. That's the gospel. That is the good news. God created man in the beginning and gave him freedom and gave him a loving relationship. And then we walked away from him. And from walking away from freedom and life, we walked into death. And so what God did in Genesis is he took Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and he created a nation for himself. And he said, you are going to represent me to the rest of humanity. But unfortunately, Israel also found itself in slavery in Egypt. And so God said, okay, I'm going to go ahead and liberate you, and one day there's going to come an even greater liberation. One day there's even going to come a greater Passover, a greater Exodus, not out of Egypt, but out of something much more dangerous and much more evil. So what happens after that? If you read the rest of the Old Testament, God's people found themselves in exile one more time, and then they eventually returned to the land. But that exile never really felt like it was done yet. They still felt, okay, we're back in Israel, but something's not right. And the reason being is because there would come one, Jesus of Nazareth, who was going to be the ultimate Passover lamb that was going to purchase us out of the exile, not of Egypt, but of sin and death. That's where the chains broke. That's where our slavery found its freedom. And we pledge ourselves to him. These words came out of two different hymns and two different hymn writers, but I want you to listen to this poem. Our pleasure and our duty, though opposite before, since we have seen his beauty, are joined to part no more. To see the law by Christ fulfilled, and hear his pardoning voice, changes a slave into a child, and duty into choice. We got to ask, what's the most valuable thing in my life? Where have I spent my time, my interest, and yes, even my money? We have to be able to prioritize so that nothing gets in the way of trusting God as our master. Because honestly, like I said, and I don't mean to do this stark of terms, but these are the terms Jesus uses. You serve one of two masters. God or something that's not God. So rather than pledging allegiance to one that will lead to death, I would encourage all of us to renew our commitment and bow the knee to the one who promises life. If God is your treasure, if God is the source of the light in your eyes, if he is your master, that's the foundation for everything else. And don't worry, he'll care for you. Let's pray. Father, we humbly ask that you would forgive us whenever we've made things that are not you into our gods, into our idols. We humbly ask that you would forgive us of these things and to get our eyes back focusing on you, focusing on the good. Turn our eyes towards Jesus. May he be our master. May he be the source of our greatest joy because, Lord, in you dying for us proved that we were the source of your greatest joy. We just ask now that we would store up for ourselves treasure in heaven, that our eyes would be full of light, and that we would only serve one master, the master who gives life, our Lord Jesus, in whose name we pray.